Welcome to the Kind Heartfulness podcast, exploring the inner reaches of the heart and mind, brought to you by Rangsheng Yeshe Gomde, Germany-Austria, and your host, Eric Solomon.
Welcome to the Kind Heartfulness podcast, and today it's my great pleasure to have as our guest Dr. Clifford Saron. We're going to have a wide-ranging, no-holds-barred conversation about meditation research and objectivity, science, spirituality, how it all comes together in the form of this great researcher, Dr. Saron, who's a research scientist at the Center for Mind and Brain Institute at the University of California, Davis. And I think he's one of the world's leading scholars, if not the world's leading scholar, on the tangible effects of meditation. And Cliff's had a long-standing interest in the effects of contemplative practice in psychology and behavior. In the early 1990s, he conducted field research investigating Tibetan Buddhist mind training under the auspices of the office of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And he's been associated with Mind and Life Institute since 1990. Dr. Saron directs the Shamatha Project, a multidisciplinary longitudinal investigation into the effects of intensive meditation on psychological and psychological processes central to well-being. I think this may be the only research project of its kind in the world, but certainly it's the most important one. And his research team is investigating how meditation experience may mitigate the effects of the COVID pandemic on chronic stress and cellular aging, as well as examining consequences of compassion versus mindfulness training on engagement with suffering. And Cliff also studies sensory processing and integration in children with autism spectrum disorders to better understand how these children experience their everyday sensory environments. So I think he's a fabulously fascinating guest, and I'm sorry that we only have an hour today to spend with him, but we're going to make the best use of that time as we possibly can. So please join me in welcoming him to our program. Dr. Clifford Saron, welcome to the Kind Heartfulness podcast.
Eric, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really happy that you joined us today, and I'd like to talk with you, of course, about meditation research and the state of meditation research. Where do you think we are in our quest to study meditation?
Well, I think that's a really interesting and important question, and also a question that perhaps is a bit tangential to the motivation to engage in research on meditation.
Good point.
I think many of us have been brought to this field by perceptions and experiences that have felt transformative in our own lives. In our encounter with a variety of different contemplative practices, teachers, experiences of insight that derive from our lives. And if one is a scientist by training, there's a natural curiosity. And perhaps even if you're not a scientist by training, there's a curiosity about what might be responsible, what sorts of mechanisms lie at the heart of these experiences, given our encounter with the varieties of quiescence and investigation that are put forward on contemplative paths, be they Buddhist, Christian, Sufi, whatever the indigenous varieties that we may come upon. In my own case, this has interest in the relationship between mind states and body states emerged in my life as a child, because I was a sick asthmatic kid who really grew up doing mindfulness of breathing without realizing it. But I was keenly aware of states of relaxation and capacities to be able to breathe, and states of fear, particularly about not being able to breathe, that made things much worse. So this opportunity to ponder this relationship, I had a lot of time in convalescence when I wasn't in school, when I wasn't out playing with other kids in summer camp because the mold got me. And even I had this experience when I was older and began sitting insight meditation retreats. I began to think that I could meditate away my my asthma, and that kind of can-do attitude fell upon the rocky shores of unskillful means.
I think we've all kind of come up against that as practitioners. We start, and our motivation's a little bit funny because on one hand in Buddhism, we're taught about reducing preoccupation with self, but secretly we're thinking if I meditate, this or that aspect of my life will get much better.
That's right. And so that can-do attitude eventually backfired to such an extent that I realized I had to take another take or I'd wind up in the emergency room.
Oh, gosh.
So I got up and I took a freaking spray and my lungs opened up. And I realized that self-compassion and care really was much more where things were at than my young adulthood fierce motivation to conquer all. That lesson happened many, many years ago, but it still resonates, and it connects with a kind of teaching that I've really enjoyed thinking about, that comes through some of the ways Jon Kabat-Zinn articulates the relationship of a lot of meditative training as it is presented in mainstream culture, which we might think of as instrumental, and where this transformative experience may ultimately reside is in the non-instrumental. And the non-instrumental is just one way of saying all the ways in which not striving, not aiming, not seeking to explain, yet putting yourself in the predicament of inquiry, in the posture of quiescence, allows for discovery. It's counterintuitive. So you're asking, what is the state of meditation research? First off, I don't know the full state of meditation research. There are many people who have now viewed this enterprise as a career path. I've been doing this a long time, and when I began to be interested, this was a career killer.
Yes. You were one of the brave pioneers who blazed the trail for all these people now to have a career path.
So I've been part of many different studies over the last 20 years, initially looking at intensive meditation retreats. I was the principal investigator of the Shamatha Project, where Alan Wallace taught 3-month retreats. at Shambhala Mountain Center, as it was named at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we've published, almost 20 papers from that work. When you think about what we were actually investigating, we're investigating a hugely complex amalgamation of social experience, a physical container in the Rockies,
Yeah.
people of like-minded persuasions, removed from their daily life, removed from their family circumstances, at elevation, in the Rocky Mountains, generally in silence,
Yes.
generally somatically quiescent when they weren't going for walks. Of course, they're meditating.
Excuse me, just for some of our listeners, can you define somatically quiescent?
Sure, sitting still.
Yeah. I get this feedback from our listeners that sometimes I don't ask our guests to explain the terms. So thank you. Yes, sitting still.
Right. So there's a joke that
we have a very international audience also, so not everybody's a native English speaker. Yeah, there's an old joke.
There's an old joke that a friend of mine and I came upon this other way of talking about somatic quiescence. If you know Yiddish, we called it the Tuchus effect.
But that's another term you're now going to have
So
to
define that. That is sitting on your bottom.
That's right.
So if you just think about the consequences of agreeing to basically sit still without moving a lot for 40 minutes, that in and of itself is a particular kind of training in inhibiting response tendencies.
Yes.
Because you're going to want to move.
Yes.
And so there are many different aspects separable from a particular meditative instruction or a metaphysical belief system or technique that impinge upon the consequences of those belief systems and techniques. Mm-hmm. And what we try to do is think about the whole enchilada. So we aren't just saying, this is what are the consequences of meditation. We think about what is the nature of this retreat experience. Mm-hmm. And of course,
I imagine also, the people who come, anybody who says, I'm going to take 3 months out of my life to do nothing but meditation has pretty high expectation. They're really looking for something to happen, right? And that must also factor into
that's in the large, I believe that is very true. Yeah. And particularly in a teaching style that might make claims of specific markers of progress.
Mm-hmm. Which Buddhism
and Buddhism definitely has that, and the teaching in these 3-month retreats had that. Mm-hmm. With respect to even the markers of attentional stabilization, vividness, and relaxation that are part of the canonical path of accomplishing shamatha.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you have a conjunction of motivation. You have all of these circumstantial elements, mm-hmm. and you have people's discoveries, and you have differences between people. And one of the things that limits what one can simply say about the state of meditation research, mm-hmm. is the broad variability of people's experiences and the variability in the results that any particular study might obtain. For instance, we looked at the consequences of 1 month meditation retreats in the Insight meditation tradition at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, not 25 minutes from where I'm talking to you from in Marin County.
Oh, yeah.
And we built a blood lab in nearby to spin down the blood of retreatants beginning and 3 weeks into their 1 month silent insight meditation retreat to look at cellular aging, the changes in the length of the telomeres, the ends caps of chromosomes in their particular type of circulating white blood cell. This is work that Quinn Conklin, who was a grad student and postdoc and collaborator now, published in Brain Behavior and Immunity with our group. Well, we found remarkably changes overall in the retreat group compared to a meditation experience control group of people who've done retreats but who aren't on retreat. But it turned out that the main effects were driven by the people who entered the retreat who were highest in neuroticism and disagreeableness compared to the other individuals.
People like me, in other words.
I don't know.
Well, you can ask some of my friends. My wife, let's get her in here.
The second person perspective is very important.
Yeah.
If you want to know the effects of these practices, perhaps we could just call it a day by asking our intimate partners.
Yeah. It's probably more than half true. So, yeah.
So anyway, what we found, I mean, this is an interesting finding.
Yeah.
If you tend to make mountains out of molehills or are, irritable in response to the exigencies of daily life,
yes,
you go to a place that sort of takes away daily life.
Yes.
If people piss you off,
right,
go to a place where you aren't talking to anybody and you aren't looking at anybody in the eye.
Yeah.
Now, if you tell this finding to teachers, they say, of course, because you've actually put the body-mind in a circumstance that allows for the diminution of this constant sort of stressor that arises in daily life. We didn't have enough money to actually do a follow-up of how those people who changed the most biologically did when they went back home. That's a critical question. We have done interesting follow-ups from the Shamatha Project up to 7 years later with respect to how people related to engaging with and memory for images of human suffering, where we found that people whose shifts in the way they responded physiologically to these images at the beginning of the retreat, people tended to sort of have a flight or fight defensive reaction to seeing these images. And then at the end of the retreat, there was much more approach motivation. There was a physiological pattern of cardiac deceleration. Instead of your heart rate accelerating when you saw these images.
These are like certain images, like people.
These were images from the International Affective Picture Set that have been used in thousands of studies. And we published this in a paper. This was the work of Brandon King and our colleagues. And we published this in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, an august journal that's been around since about 1917.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting is that 7 years later, we asked people if they remembered these images. And the images that were remembered, if they had been seen at the beginning of the 3-month retreat, they were associated with this flight or fight response.
Mm-hmm.
The images that were remembered the most
I see.
of suffering that were seen at the end of the retreat, memory was predicted by this approach motivation.
Hmm.
So that really speaks to whatever is going on in the complexity of the training environment, the practice environment, the amalgamation of teachings, sangha, nature, life on retreat, resulted in a fundamental shift in the way people were engaging with suffering. Now, images of suffering. And of course, to me, that is a critical and crucial motivating question and important skill in our lives with ever increasing relevance in the world that we live in today.
It's really important for today's world. It's one of the big challenges right now is getting people who don't agree to just listen to each other and have some empathy and at least agree to listen.
So this is the fundamental motivation for a lot of the work that we're doing now, which is following up on that finding I just described.
Wow.
Not in a retreat context, but in the context of sort of 8-week non-residential deployable trainings that seek to teach compassionate mindfulness in varieties of contexts.
So 8 weeks. How did you arrive at 8 weeks?
So you may have heard of mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Okay, yeah, that's how. So they came up with this magic 8 weeks, and now that's
so this has become a de facto standard issue. Though there's a tension between deploying some encounter with these teachings and practices that doesn't require withdrawal from your daily life, doesn't require a religious context, is able to be folded into multiple mental health and physical health care settings. And this has, over the last several decades, really taken hold as the limits of allopathic medicine are ever more seen in terms of what we cannot heal through medicine.
There doesn't seem to be any pill we can take that gets us to listen to each other with an open heart and mind. At least I don't know of one.
Yeah. There may be temporary solutions.
Yeah, I was thinking of a couple of those, but I only know those by reputation. At a certain point in my life, I decided enough was enough. And I stopped experimenting.
So 8 weeks is actually this kind of aliquot that is available if we want to look at the sorts of trainings that are offered. And those now seem highly robust compared to the world of apps.
Yes. So let me ask you one question though. Is it 8 weeks of you don't do anything else, or is it 8 weeks
these are
every day something? Is it?
For a training, say mindfulness-based stress reduction, there is an 8-week curriculum where you're in a class, say 2.5 hours a week. And then you have homework of various practices, say anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes a day.
Okay, so this is really good because probably anybody who's interested could find 8 weeks in a year where they just go through this kind of training.
Yeah, I mean, people do hobby projects that take more time out of their life.
Certainly.
And these they are designed to fill spaces that should be available in many lives.
Mm-hmm.
And can dovetail with a full-time job or family responsibilities, and really are doable. So to return to this question, the state of meditation research, one of the things that we did was to ask during the pandemic how people who meditated were faring with the stressors of the pandemic. And we wanted to see how people's psychological states, their mental health related across a year to their telomere length attrition. So Quinn
Can I
Conklin.
just give people a little mini tutorial? You can correct me if I get it wrong, but the telomeres, the end caps of your DNA sequences, as you age, tend to fray, and there's some things that happen with the enzyme. I was a biochemistry major. The enzyme that after you replicate some DNA that kind of makes a nice end again, so that, when you're young, at least it works, but gradually over time they fray. So am I in the right ballpark here? So what you're finding out is meditation made it so there was less fraying.
So there are a couple of points there.
Yeah.
In the Shamatha Project, what we found was that your telomere, we didn't measure your telomere length. We measured the enzyme that lengthens telomeres.
That's it. Telomerase or something. Telomerase. Okay, thank you.
So there are two things.
Ancient history for me.
Right.
I apologize.
So two things to think about. One is that as your cells divide, the DNA replicating complex, it's like, the zipper you have on a jacket isn't teeth all the way down.
Right.
There's this little slug where the zipper, the device that's going to stitch the zipper parts together sits and binds.
That's right.
Likewise, when you copy DNA, you cannot copy the location where the molecular machinery binds to the strand of DNA. So necessarily that little end piece doesn't get copied and gets shorter. However, there's an enzyme called telomerase, which has the capacity to rebuild that length.
That's right. That I remember.
Now,
so I'm not saying you're right. I'm saying I remember. Yes.
So if you have too much telomerase, you can immortalize cells. And that is something that happens in cancer.
Oh, yeah.
If you have too little telomerase, you get a premature cellular senescence meaning the cell can't replicate. If this is happening in your immune system, which is the cell's peripheral blood monocytes, we call them PBMCs, you have a decrease. You have a decrease in the efficacy of your immune system, and so you can wind up this being related to disease states across time. So there is an optimal region, like a Goldilocks region, for telomere length. And people who tend to live longer have longer telomeres across time compared to those who have a sort of premature shortening of these telomeres. But no telomere length, unless you have a severe clinical disorder, you cannot tell your longevity from the cellular telomere length from your blood cells, for instance. People have created companies that wish to make those sorts of claims, and people have sold concoctions that purport to lengthen your telomeres, but this is not, accepted medical practice. So
back to meditation.
So in the Shamatha Project, we did look at telomerase at the end of the 3-month retreat.
I see.
So it's a paper that we published in Psychoneuroendocrinology. Tanya Jacobs was the first author. And we did that in collaboration with Liz Blackburn and Alyssa Epple. Liz Blackburn and her colleagues got the Nobel Prize for discovering telomeres and telomerase.
Wow.
At UCSF, she was our colleagues. So what we found was really interesting. Those individuals in the 3-month retreat who experienced an increased sense of purpose in life showed higher levels of telomerase at the end of 3 months. Those than individuals who did not show an increase in a sense of purpose in life. It's not that we measured change in telomerase. It's that change in psychological traits predicted levels of telomerase at the end of the retreat. You talked about people coming in with high expectations. John Kabat-Zinn wrote an interesting book, Wherever You Go, There You Are.
Yeah, I remember.
So if you come in expecting that after 3 months of meditation, you're going to have the mind of a Buddha, and somehow you seem pretty much the same person, you may have experienced this. What was this for? You may have disillusionment. You may have subtle depression, this was not a panacea, that you've got other dimensions of life you need to handle. So it's another case of individual differences being enormously important in complexifying the answer to your initial question. You remember, we're still in the general rubric of the state of meditation research.
Yeah. Thank you.
We can talk the entire time about issues related to why that's a hard question to answer.
I think you're doing a good job of explaining why it's a hard question to answer. Thank you. It's also very interesting, though, what you are saying.
So one of the things that we did in this large contemplative coping with COVID study that Quinn Conklin has been taking the lead on, along with Jen Picorni and Savannah Van de Bos and a bunch of other folks, is that we looked at creating a tool to simply present to interested parties the raw data from 389 people around the country who, across a year of the pandemic, answered about 840 questions, investigating about 34 different constructs, from post-traumatic growth to personality change, depression, anxiety, mindfulness, discrimination, trauma, many different questions. And we've created a tool using software called Shiny Apps that is a web-based data exploration tool. So anyone can click on this tool and observe for themselves the tremendous variability in the data and patterns of correlations between different variables, and see for themselves as a kind of experiential learning procedure or encounter how variable data is from humans, and why it is not simple to make conclusions on and simple sort of elevator pitch statements on the basis of a study like this. Now, the intervention here was life. It wasn't like we're studying with a randomized control group, people who weren't subject to the pandemic. That would have been
have to go to another planet.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah.
But these teachings are not designed for anything other than life.
Yeah.
As it unfolds. So this is just a fine thing. It's not a problem. I think that, and for this podcast, we can put the link to this tool in.
Oh, yeah.
In the material,
yeah.
so your listeners can observe for themselves this sort of a thing. Now,
I think I'll just say now, because you brought it up, we'll have it in the description of the podcast, where just below Cliff's biography, there'll be a link to this data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that, to get back to this motivating question, I think that there is increasing awareness of the lack of a one-size-fits-all kind of contemplative training. And at the same time, there's an increasing awareness of the profound need in society for tools to address mental health crises in young people, conflict in our political life, and the consequences of being at the receiving end of multiple fire hoses of information. As a consequence of what social media and the internet has brought to us, and the predicaments of asking the question, what can we do on the one hand, and how can we bear witness when there isn't something to do? And I think that overarching predicament is not necessarily a call for research. It's a call for search. And in that sense, there is a need to point to innate human capacities that have kind of been deprioritized in our culture. And of course, this is, I believe, what motivates many researchers to engage with public communication of some of these teachings that might give people an experience so that they know what to do instead of looking at their phone. They know what to do when they're not looking at their phone and they want to look at their phone.
Yes. It seems to me, though, that we're really my old friends in Silicon Valley have so much money that they have studied our neurobiology and know exactly how to exploit it. And we're just totally, vulnerable, and especially children. And I mean, of course, I think there's lots of amazing things that have come out of Silicon Valley, but there is this one also problem that we have to admit, and it's just we're just totally undefended, unprepared, incapable of resisting because it's like the old days when the big food would put stuff in food that's not all that healthy for you, but that you just keep wanting to have another one, have another one. It's kind of like that, and we're a little bit helpless. It seems.
Right. Bet you can't eat just one.
Yeah, that's one of the great.
Where's the beef?
Yeah,
That's
I see.
right. So we're talking about filler and salt and fat.
Yeah.
So yes, when unlimited resources have been put to A/B testing
Yeah.
with an N of 200,000,
Yeah.
the precise average positive placement of a color or a font,
Yeah.
the thing has been made to be a glove that sort of comes on us.
Yeah.
Um,
Cliff's taking his hand and putting it like a vice grip over his face.
yeah. So it would be of utility
Mm.
to have demonstrated that simply watching the flux of the mind across time
Mm.
can reveal the cessation of urge, the resumption of urge, the nature of craving on a kind of water wheel,
Yeah.
and that it's a process without end. And therefore, a temporary solution is maybe not as ideal as making very warm and cuddly friends with your mind.
Mm. Mm.
And to do that takes some time being with yourself in a positively caring context. I think Matthew Ricard talks about caring mindfulness.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, does data convince, or do authentic communications convince? Because a lot of people can listen to the sorts of words that I'm saying and say, oh, I can't really argue with that. How much evidence do you need?
Yeah.
That the folks who started doing work in this field, the evidence was their experience. If we create structures of policy, science says,
Yeah.
we then feed the machine of the scientific hegemony,
Mm-hmm.
because science says, if you really kind of deconstruct what science says, you would be looking at all of the variability that an experiment produces. You wouldn't be saying what a scientist says.
Yes.
Because I cannot speak the variability. It's a visual plot of points. I can describe it, but if I describe it, then the initial response is, so what's the point?
Yeah.
So a response to the what's the point question is the quest to characterize these clouds of knowing and to see whether they can motivate something that is tuned to the particular individuals that might show the most impact. And perhaps for folks who show negative consequences, there are adverse consequences of meditation in retreat contexts. Any teacher will tell you about the difficulties people have come upon that have to do with unresolved trauma or misinterpretations of depersonalization moments. That's where nice. There's a tremendous potentially terror that arises. Mm-hmm. And this is not in the marketing materials, so to speak,
no,
of getting into these practices. So a caring community that wants to suggest the best practices for a given individual needs to engage in a massive effort to understand the fit for purpose for different individuals. That's an enormously labor-intensive enterprise that requires mixed methods of qualitative data to understand people's experience from their point of view, and measures that we might be able to create in the laboratory. Mm-hmm. But those measures that we might create in the laboratory represent already choices different investigators make that are not objective choices, but are motivated by their own personal experience or the conditioning of their scientific culture. This is a point that is brought out beautifully in a new book this year by Adam Frank, Marcelo Gleiser, and Evan Thompson, called The Blind Spots.
The Blind Spot. Yes, I'm reading it, actually. I did a podcast recently with John Dunn where he brought this up. And we were talking about AI, and somehow it fit. So people who are hearing this episode probably heard the previous one already, and it's now you're hearing it again. It's a book I think everybody would get something out of reading. It's an important book.
It's very clearly articulating how modes of thinking that falsely create the impression of objectivity in science.
Yes, that there's some God's eye view.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, without acknowledging the basis of that objectivity is subjectivity.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a long time dilettante in Buddhist philosophy, I'll say that, well, duh. I mean, but anyway, sorry.
Well, yes, but that's not the prevailing cultural meme that is so deeply embedded that we have phrases like science says.
Yes.
But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly.
Science says, if you have a staph infection, you should probably take an antibiotic or you might die.
Yep. And as a practitioner, I'm really gratified that my life already is far longer than the average life of practitioners 150 years ago, because I've been such a lazy practitioner. I've needed the extra time to catch up. So and that the lengthening of lifespan is due to modern science.
Right. And your beautiful smile due to fluoride.
Yeah, exactly. I won't say I have all my teeth, but I have a lot of them.
So we put gas in our cars, or we put electrons flowing through wires into our batteries.
Yep.
But at the same time, and we do know uh, features of the planet that are under stress, duress, and in poor trajectory due to human activity. These are things that we need to listen to. In the realm of statements about human experience, the enterprise gets a lot spongier because of the large variability. And that variability is a function of so many causes and conditions. So I think there's a great compatibility between the quest of scientific knowing and investigating causes and conditions. I think that that level of understanding interdependence is one of the richest overlaps in Buddhist and scientific thinking. We tend, though, to demarcate which levels of interdependence we're going to be responsible for thinking about. And then the rest sort of fall away.
Yes.
So out of, exigencies, convenience, and cognitive repression, as Evelyn Fox Keller once talked about in Scientists. So I think with respect to the charge of research in the consequences of contemplative practice, there is ever more need for thinking in aggregate about individual experience rather than sort of trying to superimpose a group of individuals in some statistically significant outcome. And that, of course, is a daunting, labor-intensive project that will require resources that typically exceed what folks have available.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
ever more intellectual humility, and there's one. But you were going to say something.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I thought you'd made your point. The thing I was just going to say is that I myself, as someone who often is in the position of giving instruction in the Dharma, meditation, compassion, and so forth, I always get it wrong when I fall back on I won't say always, usually get it wrong when I fall back on some kind of formula, meaning this teaching comes at this point to, because classically that's how it's taught. And if instead I can get myself into a space where I really listen with an open heart, mind, and some curiosity, and then I find that each person gets a different answer because each person is different and needs a different, I'm not saying my answer necessarily is always better. I think it is, but I haven't done a study. But my impression is it works out much better that way. So I think that just my own sort of non-scientific experience here is quite in line with what you're saying. I also think what I liked about the blind spot, and also what you're saying in this conversation is my big kind of, as somebody who grew up in a math science household, I was raised to be, I was told since I was a little kid I was going to be some kind of scientist. I ended up an engineer, a software engineer. I don't know if that pleased my family or not, but I took a little bit of a turn. But I was raised that way. I was a terminal rat at MIT's AI lab as a kid, and it has a lot to do with how I ended up Buddhist. But the main thing I started to see, and it was especially at the AI lab, where you had, I don't know, Daniel Dennett, of Daniel Dennett, right? So everything ends up, the universe is completely explainable as a physical state. And I think when you take it to an extreme, of everything as a physical state, and there can be a God's eye view. Then you've kind of taken it is a very nihilistic, unspiritual way to view the world. And I think, of course, there's ways of, when people, like some of my spiritual friends who, when they started talking about quantum physics, would imagine all these kinds of roles of the observer that I don't think quantum physics is saying at all, and kind of quite woo-woo in a way. I think there is something about kind of revisiting it all and saying, actually, the observer is an important part of the equation. There's no way to take the observer out of the equation. And maybe we don't know. We've tried looking for a physical basis of the universe. We haven't found it yet. Buddhism would say there is no physical basis for the universe. Exactly. There's no findable physical basis for the universe. That would be the precise way to say it. That's not denying a physical universe, but there's no findable physical basis. But we should, as Buddhists, we should also be open to revisiting that too. But the whole thing should just be still an open space of curiosity and wonder, and not trying to bring everything to a definitive conclusion and then see where it goes. So our viewers, our listeners can't see, but you're very pleased with what Cliff has folded his hands in kind of prayer and is beaming at me. I'm so relieved because I wasn't sure how that was going to go when I started to pontificate. So thank you for your kindness.
So I think this is really at the crux of what the blind spot is pointing toward. It's also what, to me, makes science spiritual. Because there is an experience to be had of mystery.
Yeah.
And mystery is kind of dwelling in the cessation of thinking that it all can be explained.
Yeah. That it can all be resolved if only we just think a little better.
So we can create holisms, mathematical completions that are our creations, that are not reality. They are descriptions. And again, this is another theme, that there's this surreptitious institution.
The map is not the
map. Korzybski lives evermore. Now, at the same time, the meaning making that we can have in the presence of not knowing can turn our curiosity into fulfillment. That's
yeah.
You can say Cliff just did a mic drop gesture.
Yeah.
So there is this bifurcation of the world into this pointing to a God's eye, objective knowing, and what we have as our direct experience, lived our life world. And
so maybe I should just explain God's eye perspective, because you and I both use it now.
Sure.
It's as if you could step outside of reality and, like from the perspective of God, look down upon all of reality while not being part of it somehow.
Right. The view from nowhere is another.
View from nowhere, yes. some theoretical place that actually doesn't exist. So anyway, yes.
So to me, what we have been talking about these last few minutes is the deep life motivation to causing a life of science to be, as Francisco Varela said, a contemplative path in and of itself. What Varela said in Monte Grande in a discussion from a movie excerpt with Joan Halifax in the early 1980s is that science in its core, in its active living core, is pure contemplation.
Mm. Mm.
It has nothing to do with manipulation. And in that sense, manipulation is in the sense of creating technologies.
Mm.
You can create instruments to extend your reach. And the creating of the instrument to extend your reach is motivated by what can you see at the end of that reach. Creating the tool isn't equal to pondering what you can see. So I don't want to give this quest to think about what might go on in life with consequences of contemplative practices, but to the extent that these practices are resolving to investigate the conditions of human existence, asking what happens when you meditate becomes an ill-posed question, or it becomes, what is life?
Yes.
And so if the state of meditation research is, what is life? It now encompasses all that can be known now and forever in the past and going forward. And so we don't need to draw a boundary around it.
Well, maybe this is a really good place to stop for today. I hope that you'll consider coming back, because I feel like we just began to start a conversation, even though it's been quite a while. It's really been a pleasure, a real pleasure having you on our podcast. Thank you so much for coming.
It's mutual, Eric. It's a conversation that could only happen between you and me today.
Perhaps that's true. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you have enjoyed today's podcast, we like to invite you to continue the journey into the heart of enlightened mind at gonde.eu.